This podcast represents a brief history of the law relating to the issues raised. This should not be relied on as a substitute for professional advice. Specific legal advice should always be sought in relation to any particular circumstances, and no liability will be accepted for any losses incurred as a result of reliance on this podcast by those relying solely on this podcast. Welcome now to Hicksons Health Hour, the podcast series that explores a variety of current legal health topics. Throughout each episode, hear from different members of our health team with expertise in the area. My name is Stojkova and I'm Special Counsel in the health team.
And I'm Joshua Ayoub. I'm a solicitor in the health team.
Today we're talking about something that's been all over the news lately, Ozempic, and the growing concerns around compounded weight loss drugs. We'll explore what Ozempic is and why it's become so popular, as well as the issues with compounded versions of the drug and what the Australian government is doing to tackle the growing crisis. If you've heard about Ozempic as a miracle weight loss drug, this episode will give you all the details you need to understand what's really going on. So, can you give us some background, Josh, on exactly what Ozempic is?
Of course. So just as an introduction, Ozempic is a prescription drug used to treat type 2 diabetes. It's administered via a weekly injection, and its primary ingredient that it uses is called semaglutide, which belongs to a class of drugs called GLP-1 receptor agonists. You might have heard of other drugs in this category, like Wegovy, which is a specific medication for approved weight loss, or Mounjaro, which is another diabetes treatment as well.
So what does Ozempic actually do?
Well, it helps to manage blood sugar levels by stimulating insulin release and reducing glucose production in the liver and slowing down the process of gastric emptying. So in essence, it helps to stabilize blood sugar and it prevents spikes, which is why it's been a game changer essentially for people living with type 2 diabetes.
Why has Ozempic become so popular?
Now, the popularity with Ozempic is attributable to its side effects of weight loss, and for many people, that's really been the main draw. So while it's designed for type 2 diabetes, doctors have started prescribing it for off-label weight loss use, which essentially means they're using it for a purpose other than its original intention. And because of the off-label use, demand for Ozempic has absolutely skyrocketed, not just from people with diabetes, but for those people looking to lose weight. And unfortunately, that's led to some unintended consequences and supply shortages, which are actually worldwide.
So how was the ever-increasing demand for Ozempic met in that case?
So as the demand for Ozempic and its related medications grew, some people turned to compounding pharmacies, which are pharmacies that specialize in creating personalized medications to get their hands on the replica versions of the drug. These versions contain the same active ingredient that I mentioned earlier, which is called semaglutide, and they mimic the weight loss effects seen in Ozempic. But this practice is fraught with risk and has raised serious concerns about the quality and safety of these compounded drugs.
Trying to meet these demands has proven to be problematic, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. So in Australia, at least 20,000 people are using the compounded weight loss drugs, or it's estimated at least, though the real number is probably much higher considering the underground nature of these transactions that's occurring. And many of these drugs come from pharmacies that are now illegally mass-producing Ozempic-like products and distributing them without proper oversight. And some of these pharmacies have been caught manufacturing these replicas under unsanitary conditions. And we're talking about really filthy, unregulated environments where drugs are being made with repurposed kitchen equipment, dirty mixing tools, and a general lack of quality control. In some cases, people have even reported receiving syringes full of a dark, sort of blood red liquid, as it's described, that they've injected into themselves, despite the concerns for its appearance. Now, these replicas are not often subject to the same stringent testing and safety, quality and efficacy standards as the real medication. As a result, people are experiencing some serious adverse reactions like vomiting blood, nerve damage, and even hospitalizations.
So to better understand the issue, let's talk for a moment about the actual compounding pharmacies.
So These pharmacies specialize in creating personalized medications for patients, especially when they can't take the commercially manufactured versions of that drug. So, for example, if someone can't swallow tablets, a compounding pharmacy might create a liquid form of that medication to make it easier for them to take.
But there's a catch, is there not?
Yes, there is. So these compounded medications aren't subject to the same rigorous assessments, I guess, for safety and quality as the commercially approved drugs are, like Ozempic. So without oversight from the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the TGA, the authority, the risk of contamination, the inconsistent potency, and dangerous side effects rise significantly.
So hasn't there been a high-profile case in relation to these issues this year?
Yes, so this year the TGA raided a pharmacy in Western Sydney. They were called the Total Compounding Pharmaceuticals, where they found Ozempic replicas were being illegally produced on a commercial scale, and the conditions were downright horrifying. They even went as far as taking photos, which you can actually access online. The facility, you'll probably see if you were to look it up, was completely dirty, repurposed kitchen mixers, hot plates, other unsanitary equipment used to mix chemicals. Like I said, the TGA released videos showing the unsafe and unhygienic conditions under which the drugs were being produced, and it was clear that these replicas weren't being made with proper care, and they certainly weren't safe for human use.
So then what's been the Australian government's response to this crisis?
So in Australia, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, like I mentioned earlier, the TGA, is the regulatory body that evaluates, assesses, and monitors medicines. A medicine can't be sold in Australia until it's been registered with the TGA and included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, which is referred to as the ARTG. Now, Ozempic was registered on the ARTG in August 2019, specifically for the treatment of type 2 diabetes.
Isn't the law a little more complicated, though, when it comes to compounded versions of Ozempic-like drugs?
That's right. So while pharmacies are allowed to compound certain medications for individual patients under a prescription, the intention is always for personalized use, and it's not for mass production by any means. The law allows for exemptions in specific cases, but illegal commercial production of compounded drugs like Ozempic clearly falls outside of these exemptions. So in May of this year, the Australian Federal Health Minister, Mark Butler, announced a major change. That is, starting on October 1, 2024, GLP-1 class drugs like semaglutide will no longer be allowed to be compounded by pharmacies. So that essentially means that prescriptions for weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy will need to go through proper medical channels. That is, patients will need to get a script from a doctor.
So then what does all this mean for prescribers and their obligations?
So in Australia, medical practitioners can apply to become authorised prescribers of an unapproved drug under the Therapeutic Goods Act. That's in 1989. But this is a strict process, and it's designed to ensure that only qualified doctors can prescribe unapproved drugs like semaglutide.
So what specific requirements must doctors meet to become authorised prescribers?
So doctors must meet very specific requirements, those being they need to be fully registered with the Medical Board of Australia, they must have appropriate training and expertise for the condition that's being treated, and they must be able to monitor the outcomes of the treatment and ensure it's working safely for those patients. Once registered, these doctors have several key responsibilities, and they include staying informed about the risks and benefits of the medication, obtaining informed consent from patients before prescribing the drug, monitoring the patients during and after the treatment, and reporting any adverse events to the TGA.
So what happens next?
Well, as the global demand for Ozempic and other weight loss drugs continues, we can probably expect shortages to persist potentially into 2025 as well. The TGA is trying to control who gets access to these drugs by limiting prescriptions for type 2 diabetes patients and advising doctors to prescribe Wegovy, which is also a semaglutide-based drug for weight loss. However, Wegovy is much more expensive and it requires more frequent injections, and as a result, many patients may continue to seek cheaper alternatives, including the compounded versions of semaglutide, which will likely feed into the sort of black market for these drugs, if you will. And as for the government's response, it's clear there will be probably more raids on pharmacies who are producing illegal versions of or compounding the illegal versions of these drugs. And the authorities are, it's clear, cracking down, but the demand for these drugs isn't likely to disappear anytime soon.
Well, that's all for today's episode. We've discussed the ins and outs of Ozempic, the dangers of compounded drugs, and the steps the TGA is taking to manage the crisis. It's certainly a complex issue, and we'll continue to monitor it as things unfold.